Some of y'all may know this, but I didn't go to seminary right out of high school. In fact, I have a history degree from Nichols State University before I went to seminary. And I started at Nichols, and it was April of 2007. I was in my last semester at Nichols. And I had to take 21 hours that semester. Y'all know that's like 3 extra classes that you'd have to take. And the reason why I had to take 21 hours that last semester, in my father's own words, well, if you didn't play around your first 2 years at Nichols, you wouldn't be taking 21 hours your last semester. The problem with taking 21 hours your last semester of college is that they're all upper level classes. There's no basic classes that are a little easier. All of these classes were hard classes. And for history majors, there's always an 8 to 10 page paper that goes along with the upper level history classes. And conveniently enough, they were all due within a 2-week span. Also conveniently enough, I was a very hard procrastinator back then, and so I didn't start those papers until the 2 weeks that they were due. And if you can imagine, probably averaging about an hour or 2 asleep for 2 weeks while I was getting those papers done. Those papers were hard, and I know that in between those papers, about the 3rd paper in, I started to have thoughts roll through my head. How can I get by these papers? How can I delay them being due later on? How can I make up an excuse that they wouldn't be there, that I can get around them? I wasn't trying to go through them. I wasn't trying to solve the problem directly. I was trying to get around them in some ways. That's our gospel today. That's what the Pharisees are asking. How can we get around these marriages that we've entered into? And Jesus brings it back to the book of Moses, right? He brings it back to Exodus, and he brings it back to Leviticus and Deuteronomy. And he says, what did Moses tell you to do? And he said, well, he allowed us to write a bill of divorce. And we have to remember that we're not in the same culture that they're talking about, right? We're in a much different culture. So if someone divorces someone else, the culture is set to where we protect people, right? People have rights. Back then, we have to remember that it wasn't that kind of culture. If a man did not divorce a woman, but stopped supporting the woman, she would be destitute. She would be demolished because there was no job really for her to have at that time. You can't just go down the street and get a job and support yourself. So the right of bill of divorce was not just to allow them to separate. It was specifically for the protection of women. It was so that the woman can be divorced and have a saying that she is divorced so that someone else can marry her. Because if he just left her on the hook like that but still wouldn't support her, then he couldn't marry her. And that's why Jesus says, because of the hardness of your hearts, he allowed this. Meaning that it wasn't just because of some freeloading commandment. No, it was because there were Jews that were deliberately exploiting other Jews. There were men politically exploiting women at that time. And so that's where that commandment's from. But Jesus brings it back to the book of Genesis, which we heard in our first reading, right? He brings it back to the original design. The original design is that two become one flesh. When I prepare couples for marriage, I tell them that this is going to be one of the most beautiful things that you're going to enter into, but it's also going to be one of the most difficult things that you enter into. Why? Because marriage is designed so that people suffer. And I hate to say that as in like, oh, your marriage is just about hardship. No, it's designed to have you die to yourself. That's what it's about. It's about to wean the selfishness out of you. Because you're not just thinking about yourself anymore. You're thinking about your wife or your spouse or your husband. You're thinking about the children and the family that you have. Your actions and everything you do is not just about you or us. It's about what is here. And that's something that's very difficult to do because there are times like me when I was 20 years old that we want to get around it. How can I get around this action? How can I manipulate in this situation? That's not what God calls us to. He calls us to the difficult road. He calls us to a road that is challenging, but it is beautiful if we have the eyes to see it. I tell every couple that I prepare for marriage, your job now isn't just to get you to heaven. It's to get you and your spouse to heaven. Two become one flesh. Two have to come into heaven, not just one. So if we're not doing that, if we're not entering into that position, then we're not doing it right. My job as a priest is to get you to heaven too. That's the covenant that I entered into. So as we come to the table, Lord, let us remember the vows that we have made to each other. Let us remember that marriage is something that is very good, even if it is challenging. And just because it is challenging doesn't mean it's not worth entering into. So let us remember that as we keep striving for the kingdom of heaven.